Thank you very much. Good morning, grüß Gott. I would like first to thank the organizers, Peter, for having me here, for allowing me to speak here. I'm glad to be here, but I'm nervous and I'm absolutely no specialist on cognitive science. I'm absolutely not in my comfort zone, but let's see. What I will do in the following 20 minutes is only an attempt out of a discontent about the current situation in a field of classical archaeological research, the iconography of religious rituals in the Roman Empire. All of us know that animal sacrifice was the most important ritual in the Roman Empire, and therefore depictions of animal sacrifice figure prominently in Roman visual culture. In recent scholarship on Roman religion, however, the grand theories on sacrifice, especially animal sacrifice, established by scholars like Walter Burkert, Marcel Détienne, René Girard, Jonathan Smith, and Jean-Pierre Vernon, have been abandoned or have been massively questioned, to say the least, and no alternatives have been created to replace them. That led to the present situation in which the ritual of animal sacrifice is understood as self-evident and or is lacking a religious explanation. In classical archaeology, at least in German tradition, as a subject without a large body of own theories, this move away from religious concepts had consequences for the study of the iconography of ritual. Visual depictions of animal sacrifice are currently analyzed either in an extremely positivist way by iconographically scrutinizing ever smaller figurative elements, or are only seen as means for representation in a purely political and social discourse. Both approaches have in common that they neglect religious contents at all. This is a deeply unsatisfactory situation because ignoring religion in religious iconography is not really convincing. To get out of this impasse, I searched for new theory-based approaches, and I took notice of the field of cognitive science of religion. I hope that I found what I was looking for, but maybe I am too naive. As examples of the monuments I'm occupied with, I show you friezes found in two cities of Asia Minor, Perge and Hierapolis. The relief of the theater at Perge decorated the scaene fronts of this late Antonine till Severan building. Its precise location was most prominent, the pediment above the central porta regia, consisting of a larger frieze and two shorter projecting slabs. The entire frieze is composed in strict symmetry, with the seating goddess Perge, the female personification of the polis, in the center, holding in her right hand the aniconical Xoanon of Artemis Bergaia, the main goddess of the city, and in her left the cornucopia. From both sides, 6 men clad in chiton and himation approach. Each man guides a nox and a sibu, thus forming a sacrificial procession which continues on the two projecting reliefs. The frieze concludes on both ends with a depiction of the ritual killing. 2 bulls were killed by attendants using knives. The next depiction of animal sacrifice is found at the theater of Hierapolis, modern-day Pamukkale. It was built during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the first half of the 2nd century AD and renovated in the beginning of the 3rd century. At this time, the scaene fronts, the front of the stage, was rebuilt as an impressive 3-story facade with elaborate decoration, forming the greatest sculptural complex of Roman Asia Minor. Aside mythological friezes, a procession and sacrifices to the goddess Artemis Ephesia are depicted. It starts with 3 standing young women on the left in a gesture of salutation and adoration. The following slab is decorated with a relief depicting two women and the figure of Artemis Ephesia. At the left, a woman with covered head disperses incense on an altar. At the right, a second woman sprinkles water on Artemis' head with a twig. After this section of veneration, the action changes because the next slabs show men guiding bulls or oxen to the right. The servants were accompanied by a woman in long garment presenting a garland and a young servant in chiton holding a basket. The next slab abounds on persons and actions. Two girls with covered head are playing double flutes. An attendant in chiton and hemation holds a bull by a rope, and the sacrifice is actually going to be executed. A second attendant in exomis and broad girdle lifted his arms ready to strike a blow with an instrument not to identify anymore and to kill the bull. The following sequence is very similar to that at the beginning. A person at a flaming altar offers incense, followed by a woman adoring the figure of Ephesian Artemis standing in an architectural setting. These are only two examples of depictions of animal sacrifice. They have, of course, some common features, but more astonishing are the differences, given the fact that, as far as we know, the same ritual sequences are depicted. In customary archaeological practice, focus is laid on details like garment, tools, and other details without regarding the main facts that here religious rituals are depicted and that the visual realizations differ considerably. According to my opinion, approaches of the cognitive science of religion could help to remedy these shortcomings. Aside the seminal works on ritual by Pascal Boyer, Robert Macaulay, and E. Thomas Lawson, I found the cognitive resource depletion model helpful. It is developed by Danish scholars, by Uffe Skrød and colleagues, for example, Jesper Sørensen and Joseph Bulbulia, and published 2013 in the journal Religion, Brain and Behavior. This model seems to me highly promising, since it helps not only to get a profound understanding of animal sacrifice, but also an explanation for the relevance of visual depictions, especially important for me as an archaeologist. There's a long tradition of scholars studying religion that rituals own a set of distinct features that separate them from other types of behavior. Such features include formality, repetition, redundancy, stereotypy, invariance, causal opaqueness, and goal demotion. We heard about that yesterday. Collective rituals as animal sacrifice are seen as ideal means for the transmission of symbolic ideas. Bartsch, Halbwachs. The starting point for establishing the cognitive resource depletion model, thereafter CRD model, was based on the observation that little is known about the cognitive mechanisms that mediate this symbolic transmission hypothesis at the level of cognitive processing. Because executive functions and attention recruit the same frontal region of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, these regions have been found to compete for cognitive resources in demanding situations. This observation is the basis for a resource model in which a strong increase of cognitive load detracts from executive processes because it depletes a common pool of resources. This phenomenon is called cognitive resource depletion. According to the principle of predictive coding, the way brain makes sense of the world is by constantly generating predictive models about the world, which are continuously compared and updated according to input from the sensory apparatus. If the brain detects a mismatch between its own predictions and the sensory input, the predictions will be changed. Against this background, cognitive resource depletion may also have a negative impact on the brain's capacity for these two tasks, error monitoring and updating predictive models. This model is especially valid in context of two features of ritual behavior: causal opaqueness and goal demotion. Humans generally process all actions in a hierarchical system by parsing them into low-level units, which are then integrated into coherent action representations based on the intentional and causal specification. There are three hierarchical levels of action parsing: scripts, behavior, and gesture. For example, a script would be cleaning the kitchen. This script consists of various behaviors as cleaning a glass, cleaning a dish, and so on, whereby the behavior cleaning a glass includes the gestures raising a glass, grasping a cloth, rubbing the glass with a cloth. Research on the perception of ordinary actions suggests that we automatically link gestures into a causally coherent sequence without large allocation of attention to these single low-level units. Our systems, however, are arrested when cognitive predictions are disrupted by error-checking processes. When actions are goal-demoted and causally opaque, we are forced to parse at a gestural level. Causal opaqueness and goal demotion of rituals transform ordinary actions with relatively low attentional loads on basic action perception into less predictable behavior with a much higher attentional load. According to the CRD model, participating in, or, that is important for me, observing such rituals may cause depletion and limit the capacity of the participants to construct their own narrative accounts of the events and to form causally and intentionally meaningful representation of these interactions. Something what is excitingly new for a classical archaeologist is the opportunity that these hypotheses and assumptions could be tested in a series of behavioral studies. Skjød and colleagues found that exposure to non-functional behavior resulted in an increasing segmentation rate compared to functional behavior. The second test was still more important. In that experiment, the effect of familiarization has been probed because participants often practice or watch the same ritual several times or even on a regular basis and may learn to parse rituals more easily. It was found that familiarization had no effect on action segmentation. Thus, rituals prevent individuals from forming ordinary interpretations of these actions by depleting the cognitive resource required for such constructions. This depletion leaves participants with an inferential gap which amplifies a search for meaningful interpretations of the ritual after the event and which facilitate the communication of collective propositions delivered before and, of course, after the event. These collective propositions can be communicated both by means of verbal narratives, but also, and this is the point I want to make, by means of visual depictions. The images from Priene and Hierapolis are used as examples, depict animal sacrifice as a common script consisting of common behaviors like driving a bull or killing an animal, and also several common gestures. Differences exist on the level of gestures, like killing the bull by using a knife or killing the bull by using an axe or a club. But they differ on the higher level of symbolic representation and meaning. The frieze from the theater at Berge depicts in a very clear-cut manner the decisive role of the leading families from which the magistrates of the polis originate. Members of this highest social group of the city appear as the main actors of sacrifice, directly beside the goddess of Berge, while the killing, although the main action of the entire ritual, is relegated to the less visible subsidiary sites. Thus, the frieze from Berge commemorates the ritual as a reflection of the social order, and by these means perpetuates the social hierarchy of the polis. The frieze from Hierapolis significantly contrasts in its basic message. Here, the animal sacrifice is part of a larger narrative, picturing the ritual veneration of Artemis Ephesia on two different locations. Much more weight is laid to the various ritual acts, and the narrative character of the frieze is much more pronounced. Thus, the ritual is interpreted as part of the city's history and maybe as means to connect Hierapolis with other polis in Asia Minor, for example, Ephesus. Be that as it may, the meaning of the representation is different to that of the Perge frieze, and my hypothesis is that this ambiguity is enabled by and a result of the lacking determination of the meaning of the animal sacrifice itself. This lack could be exemplified by many more pictorial representations. But I will end here, and my thesis are: animal sacrifice as a collective ritual has no common meaning for all participants and was not interpreted by them in the same way. This lack of fixed personal interpretation could be explained according to the cognitive resource depletion model and allows for, or even makes necessary, collective religious symbolic interpretations. These interpretations could be made, inter alia, by depictions which filled that gap. This line of argument would explain one essential characteristic of the depictions of sacrifice in the Roman Asia Minor, their lack of compositional, iconographical, and interpretorial similarity or even homogeneity. And it would provide an explanation for that lack based not only on external non-religious factors like the aim of personal representation, but often an explanation grounded on the cognition of religious ritual itself. Finally, there are two questions which have to be raised. Firstly, is animal sacrifice the right kind of ritual the cognitive resource depletion model can be applied to? Is the behavior animal sacrifice causally opaque and goal-demoted to that extent that the CRD model is valid? I think yes. Animal sacrifice is not only killing an animal and butchering. The purpose is to please the gods and to feed the gods, but animal sacrifice consists of a plethora of single gestures which were highly opaque, from choosing the right kind of animal to cutting locks off from the forehead to the right burning of tails on the altar. Thus, animal sacrifice meets all the requirements for applying the CRD model. The second, more important question is, of course, if the CRD model is correct. We all know the sentence attributed to George Box. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Is the CRD model useful? That is a question I'm not able to answer, and especially for that, I'm looking forward to your comments and advices. Thank you very much.
When I submitted the title for this paper last April, I had a vague idea of what it might be about come October. But in the last 48 hours, the picture has necessarily become much clearer. And so, under a revised title, I bring you Cognitive Archaeology, Associative Learning, and Greek Chorea. That is, the communal multimedia song dance that was ubiquitous across the Greek world. I show you here an image of a teacher and pupil within a woman's chorus. The maiden's locks flow down her back while her instructor wears her hair bound up in matronly fashion. They are part of a greater composition of 7 ring dancers circling the interior of this exquisite libation bowl in Boston. The dancers move to the rhythms provided by the pipe player at the front. The 2 young girls, second and third to the end, are schooled in their steps by the older women. The shape of the vase itself is one with ritual function. It is a fiale from which a liquid offering would be poured, perhaps onto a flaming altar, such as that is shown painted upon it. Form, function, and decoration come together in this singular object that both embodies and signifies female ritual action. The memorization of hymns sung during practiced ring dances enabled generations of young Greeks to learn the foundation myth histories of their communities, the stories of gods and heroes, and the values held dear by their ancestors, thus transmitting fixed identities down through the ages. Much of this choral training took place within local sanctuaries of Apollo for boys and Artemis for girls. Regular song dance competitions held at festivals, both local and Panhellenic, gave communities a chance to show off the promise of the next generation and to highlight the glory of their particular Polish identities. Choral performance has been much studied. Its function in community building, socialization and integration, establishment of gender norms are all well known. Today, I focus exclusively on the pedagogical function of song dance, and in particular, insights expressed in Plato's Laws 672e, choral dancing is the entirety of education. Peter has asked us to state up front which branch of cognitive theory we will access in our papers, and I look to neuroscience, more specifically to ongoing research on mirror neurons, dance, and associative learning. Discovered just over 20 years ago in the monkey brain, mirror neurons have now been evidenced in the human brain as well. What is intriguing about many mirror neurons is that they fire not only when the animal is performing an action, such as grasping a banana, but also when the animal passively observes a similar action performed by another agent. Our own Peter Meineck has effectively explored the implications of such kinesthetic empathy on the part of audiences watching Greek drama. When it comes to Greek chorea, we need only think of the Homeric hymn to Apollo, 156-64, in which the Ionians are so delighted with the performance of the Delian maidens that each spectator, quote, might think that he himself were singing. In a passage that has been elucidated in the work of Sarah Olson, who I'm very happy to have just met this morning. Within 10 years of the discovery of mirror neurons, the rich potential for examining human dance through brain imaging was recognized. Dance involves long-term and intensive practice of sensoromotor skills. The type and duration of training can be quantified. Dance provides a unique opportunity to investigate human brain plasticity and its interaction with behavior and learning, as long-term dance training is seen to change both gray and white matter structures. In 2005, Brown, Martinez, and Parsons pioneered the neural basis of human dance, placing amateur tango dancers in a PET scanner. Their findings elucidated for the first time the neural systems and subsystems that underlie dance. The activation of the cerebellum in the entrainment of dance steps to music, the putamen in metric motion, and the superior parietal lobule in spatial guidance of leg movements. Today, I make particular use of the recent and exciting contributions of Cecilia Hayes of Oxford University and her collaborators, who have advanced the theory that mirror neurons are the byproducts of associative learning, as opposed to evolutionary adaptation. Hayes argues that mirror neurons in humans are the product of social interaction and not an evolutionary adaptation for action understanding. This provides a straightforward, testable explanation of the differences between monkeys and humans that have led some researchers to question the very existence of a mirror neuron system. Furthermore, it shows that mirror neurons can be changed in radical ways by sensoromotor training. This has big implications for our understanding of song dance as a primary educational tool. And so we take a small step into the arena of cognitive archaeology. The roots of the field go back to the 1980s, yet cognitive or cognitive processual archaeology, that which attempts to establish rigorous methodologies for studying the ancient mind, did not fully enter the spotlight until 1994 with the landmark publication of Colin Renfrew and Ezra Zubrow's edited volume, The Ancient Mind. Here, the archaeology of religion took center stage as Renfrew focused on ancient ritual. And it is within this sphere of ancient religion that I examine the rituals of Greek song dance today. The human body in practice motion set to the beat of music is of central importance to our understanding of the social processes through which individuals developed, formed communities, and learned. Among our earliest images of humans are those that show individuals reaching out to join hands in the iconic motions of a circle dance. In his 2003 study, Dancing at the Dawn of Agriculture, Josef Garfinkel assembled painted images from 170 Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites across the Near East and southeastern Europe, collecting representations of dancers on ancient pots from present-day Iran, Syria, Egypt, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Garfinkel emphasized the ubiquity of the circle dance as a vehicle for communication within the complex societies of early village communities. Such images continued down through the ages, both in painted pottery and sculptures in the round. In the Greek world, we find terracotta models of dancers, some circling lyre players, as those shown here from Crete in the Middle Minoan to Late Minoan period, and on through the Iron Age in bronze and limestone examples from the Greek mainland and Cyprus. The circular shape of pots continued to provide the perfect form for showing ring dancers, as we see on this 8th century vase in Athens. Here, women join hands in a dance circling the vessel's neck, while men dance behind a lyre player, circling the belly of the pot. Material culture provides endless images of choruses through the ages, and each in its own way accesses certain constants: socialization, community, kinesthetic empathy, and mimesis, as does this vibrant wall painting showing a woman's chorus from a tomb in Ruvo, a work of the 5th century BC. Many of these scenes depict individuals not only dancing, but learning, further highlighting the insights we can draw from Plato's dialogue in Laws 672e, which takes place during a long walk from Knossos to the Idaean cave on Crete, that is, during a pilgrimage. The Athenian remarks, "In our view, chorea as a whole is identical with education as a whole, and the part that is concerned with the voice consists of rhythms and harmonies." Plinius replies, "Yes." And the Athenian, "And the part concerned with bodily motion possesses in common with vocal motion rhythm, besides which it possesses gesture as its own peculiar attribute, just as tune is the peculiar attribute of vocal motion." Plato goes on to advocate dance masters for boys and dancing mistresses for girls. The gods, he reminds us, are our companions in the dance. They stir us into life, and so we follow them, joining hands together in dances and songs. Instruction in choral hymn singing educated the young in local myth, history, and identity, while dancing reinforced the memorization of words and gave exercise to the body. Music and singing reinforce motor memory, while arms and legs move to the beat of practiced notes and words. Song dance played a dominant role in Greek education precisely because it helped the young to remember the words of the hymns, myths, and stories that bound their communities together. And even to this day, choral performances can be seen to build community, transmit identity, socialize the young, and teach them where they come from. The use of neuroscience in cognitive archaeology is still in its infancy, but let me leave you one promising area of future work and collaboration. Much, if not most, of Greek chorea took place within the context of competitions at religious festivals as kinesthetic gifts for the gods. I show you here a wine jug found in the Athenian Kerameikos with a very early inscription of 8th century BC date, indicating that the vessel was a prize won in just such a dancing contest. Whoever of all these dancers now plays most delicately, to him this. And this well-known Araballus found on Temple Hill at Corinth is further evidence of dance competitions. In this case, I believe we are looking at the Bibasis dance, in which a youth leaps into the air and kicks his heels to his buttocks multiple times. The lead boy is shown here in high action, performing to music supplied by the pipe player. 6 boys behind him stand in ready position, awaiting their turn. The inscription informs us that Pyrrhus, who is the best dancer, an inscription written in Corinthian alphabet. Pyrrhus is the lead dancer, and the vase belongs to him. Brain research on how competition might facilitate learning would be enormously useful in examining whether the intensity of ancient song dance competitions imprinted words and movements more forcefully on the brains of those who participated. Insofar as competition enhances attention and motivation, it is likely to speed acquisition and enhance retention of learned skills. However, this depends somewhat on personality. In conclusion, the centrality of song dance as a primary tool of paideia can be better understood within the context of ongoing work in neuroscience. Celia Hayes argues that the associative account the associative account applies that mirror neurons come from sensoromotor experience, and that much of this experience is obtained through interaction with others. Therefore, if the associative account is correct, the mirror neuron system is a product as well as a process of social interaction. And there is good news. The associative hypothesis is supported by recent data showing that even in adulthood, the mirror neuron system can be transformed by sensoromotor learning. No one has communicated this more vividly than Michael Kakoyannis in the final moments of his masterpiece, Zorba the Greek, which I ask you to watch, making special note of these elements: the desire to learn, starting on the beat, the finger snap, then the music, then the linking of arms, followed by mimesis, kinesthetic empathy, associative learning, and finally change. Miraculously, before our eyes, in under 2 minutes, we watch the buttoned-up Englishman, played by Alan Bates, utterly transformed through the power of dance into a Mediterranean, a Greek. And the social integration through the power of chorea is complete. And now,
teach me to dance. Will you?
Dance? Did you say dance? Come on, my boy. Together. Let's go. Up. Again. Up. Down. Yasu Lavendi. Boss, I have so much to tell you. I never loved a man more than you. Hey, boss, did you ever see a more splendiferous crash? You can laugh too, huh? Hey, you laugh!
You saw how they all ran.
Especially the monks.
The third time was the best. Nothing left.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to be here to kind of share my attempts at cognitive research, and I'm also grateful to be part of such a great panel. Okay, so today I attempt to apply cognitive behavioral research on learning and memory, the processes of encoding, storage, retrieval of information in pursuit of long-term retention and accessibility, to the examination of the cognitive effects of public statue monuments and their associated ritual events. This occurs under the wider theoretical umbrella of distributed cognition, the idea that cognition is not only internal but interacts with external tools. In doing so, we may move towards a more complete understanding of how these objects functioned as commemorative monuments. Turning to cognitive approaches allows us to ask how success is achieved and whether this success can be taken for granted in all cases. It's beyond the scope, or at least of, what I feel comfortable with saying, the scope of archaeological or textual evidence to delve into the storage part of the cognitive learning process, as its study is dependent on observations of neurological activity. There are, however, ancient testimony and various material evidence for behaviors and expectations that lend themselves better to the investigation of encoding and retrieval, though not without some significant caveats. First, I choose here to focus on public portrait statues, which are formulaic, contrived, and rhetorical. As such, it is arguably different than studying the learning cognition of, for instance, vocabulary words in modern academic or lab settings. Second, it is impossible to test any hypotheses about the cognitive impact of ancient objects, as no records were kept on whether the intended audience was able to recall the honorants at some later time. However, distributed cognition has indeed been applied to earlier historical periods. Very recently, an example I can think of, Reformation England, with similar constraints. And what has been shown is that even without modern psychological or neuroscientific apparatuses and methodologies, pre- and early modern societies thought and debated seriously about the processes of memory and how to instill information of value or articles of faith in individuals through external devices. Of course, memory cognition has been applied almost 20 years ago to the study of classical literary culture by Small in her Wax Tablets of the Mind. Among the various testimonia regarding Roman memory and rhetoric, the most famous and oft-cited, including at this conference, is probably the Loci, the Mind Palace, so I'm not going to go over that again. The success of such a mnemotechnic relies on the ability of the rhetorician to remember correctly the paired device, rhetorical device, and the invented image as progress is made mentally through a familiar house plan. As Andrew Rigsby noted yesterday, even Quintilian expressed some skepticism towards this technique for all the mental work that is required, at least for memorizing just a set speech. Instead, he and Cicero did advise students to practice a fixed text constantly for delivery, despite the tedium of such a task, and the former also noted that a speech seemed to ripen and mature overnight to become even more firmly entrenched in the brain. For the most part, this type of memorization is aimed at producing a successful recitation. If access to the text is needed over the long term, one could rely on a written version. This is not the kind of commemorative purpose that public portraits are thought to serve. How then did a public portrait statue work to make its subject well and endearingly known, not just to family and acquaintances, but to larger audiences? To start, let us consider this encounter with a public portrait. In a letter to Macrinus, Pliny the Younger related how the public had voted to grant 2 public portraits as praise and consolation to Vestricius Spurna on the death of his son Cottius. Cottius was a friend of Pliny's, and he remarked that he was glad this unusual honor was granted to the exceptionally virtuous and outstanding young man. Pliny thought that the posthumous statue was granted not only to preserve the memory of Cottius, but also as an example for other youths to emulate and for fathers to seek to beget and raise worthy sons. For himself, Pliny took some consolation in the portrait, for, and I'm quoting, "It will be a great satisfaction to me to be able to look at this figure from time to time as I pass by, contemplate it, stand underneath, and walk to and fro before it. For if having pictures of the departed placed in our homes lightens sorrow, how much more these public representations of them, which are not only memorials of their air and countenance, but of their honor and glory besides." This account presents a notable juxtaposition as Pliny contrasts the emotional recollections he would experience at the statue with what he believes to be more typical reactions from the population at large. On the one hand, he is moved by the prospect of gazing at and spending time with Cottius's likeness due to his affection for the youth. From those not so close to Cottius, however, these reactions were not expected. Clearly, Pliny believes that it was the honor embodied by the statue of Cottius that would inspire others to live blamelessly or to rear good children. What Pliny would associate with the portrait would be his own memories, while its significance to the larger population would be the knowledge of why this young man was so honored. The difference between memory and knowledge is not simply a matter of wordplay and nuance, but are two cognitively different categories, that of episodic or autobiographical memory and semantic memory, which also is referred to as knowledge. Whereas episodic memory, described, for instance, by a sentence like, "When I was 10 years old, I was chased down my street by a neighbor's dog and it was very scary," is specific to an individual's self-awareness and important in forming one's personal and social identities. Semantic memory is divorced from the place and time at which it is formed and constitutes the basis of a person's general knowledge. An example of semantic memory would be the order of the English alphabet. The ABCs were learned by us at an early point in our lives and tested at various points, especially soon after it was learned. We probably can't remember when we actually learned the alphabet, but now we can usually recite it on demand. So to reframe, the statue of Cottius is for Pliny a prompt for episodic memory, but for most others, it would be an element of the semantic memory of the public's decision to honor Cottius. The public portrait in this context, then, does not work as a carrier of memories in the popular sense, nor was it really understood as having that capacity. If we consider that most viewers of a public honorific portrait likely had no personal relationships with the subject, then the importance of these objects as tools for the dissemination and reinforcement of knowledge rises to the fore. How does modern cognitive research on learning and memory help us to understand public portraits in this way? In contrast to the suggestions of Cicero and Quintilian to students of oratory, the ample body of memory and learning research has demonstrated that cramming and repetition of text only facilitates a very short-term retention, and that while intervals between practice do in fact reinforce encoded information, brief intervals, such as one day, have minimal effect on strengthening the durability of knowledge. It is widely acknowledged that the initial encoding of information, a neural change that accompanies a mental experience at one time, is strengthened each time that piece of information is retrieved, as the act of retrieval appears to cause new neural changes and connections, and at the same time renders that item of information open to further elaboration. But retrieval, cognitively speaking, is not merely rereading. Rather, retrieval calls on one to access with effort encoded information, whether on a voluntary basis or through prompts or cues, such as with testing. So this is, often referred to as the testing effect. In addition, research on learning shows that in order for encoded information to endure and become a fixed element of general knowledge, it has to be retrieved over longer temporal intervals. In considering the public portrait monument as a learning tool, then, we must first address the information that is being encoded. I believe that when a vote is taken by the popular assembly or the council of a given city to acknowledge some notable person's service or career, the fact of that honor and the worthiness of its recipient are encoded in the minds of that voting body. Where a private citizen erects a public portrait in his or her own honor or for a relative, the purported merits of that individual is the resulting encodable information. So for this freshly encoded knowledge of public honor to have any persistence in the minds of the public, it must be retrieved. As cognition can be distributed externally, that retrieval can be prompted by the display of public inscriptions and portraits. These portrait monuments were set up in places such as the market square, the theaters, along streets, near or within public buildings such as baths and gymnasia. These are obviously high-traffic areas, places that a city dweller would pass by frequently during the course of daily life. However, location alone does not call for or guarantee viewing or any significant interaction with a portrait monument, especially as these same places were crowded with statues. There was, to be sure, some concern regarding the quick obsolescence of a public honorific portrait's ability to promote the knowledge of elite identity and public praise, some attestation of which we find in the speech of Dio Chrysostom. Granted, the Rhodian oration is rhetoric and may be subject to exaggeration for effect. Nevertheless, it does describe aspects of viewing that could not have been alien to the listeners. Dio's screed against the reinscription of statue bases highlights the breach of trust between community and elite benefactors and the resulting meaningless statues. Statues would become unrecognizable and therefore pointless because not only the name but the reason for a person's honor would have been lost. In other situations, the sheer congestion of statues in public areas necessitating their clearing would suggest that there was an understanding that more than mere marble, bronze, or gilding was necessary in order for a public portrait to successfully promote and reinforce the knowledge of the statue's recipient beyond the circle of intimate associates. A statue must command attention, therefore, if it is to serve as an effective retrieval cue. If, for example, reference is made to the statue as part of the act of official acknowledgement, or a new marker is erected next to it, then perhaps it would be more likely for a passerby to pick out a specific statue from the crowd. For instance, a lengthy dossier of inscriptions from Inoanda related to the founding of a musical festival called the Demostheneia in the Hadrianic period records that the Boule called for the documents concerning and ratifying the terms of the gift were to be inscribed on a stele to be set up next to the already standing statue of Gaius Julius Demosthenes, the benefactor, in the Agora. The statue then was given renewed attention both by the issuance of this decree and by the epigraphic monument that was erected next to it. Moreover, the statue clearly was set up to honor Demosthenes for another earlier service, likely the construction of a large food market that he had already built for the city. The information encoded when that portrait was first dedicated would then change upon subsequent retrieval, and with each viewing of the statue, the viewer would also incorporate the patron's additional act of generosity. There were yet other ways of drawing attention to a public portrait. It was not uncommon for decurions or members of the less prestigious Augustales to put up portrait monument to himself and perhaps to a spouse at his own expense in the meeting place of the association or in public. The erection of these portrait monuments was recorded in inscriptions that additionally document ceremonies to take place at these statues. There were sometimes celebratory banquets at the dedication. In other instances, statues were to be cleaned, anointed with unguents, dressed, and lit up with candles, concurrently with a distribution of money, sometimes to various subsets of a town's population or to the membership of the same group of which the portrait subject had been a part. While the dedication banquets are often one-time occurrences, the custodial rituals and handouts were mandated on an annual basis, sometimes on the birthday of the portrait subject, other times on significant religious dates and holidays. Cognitively speaking, what we see in such situations is, I believe, the encoding of information, a private citizen's generosity and worthiness with the initial pledge or dedication of the portrait, and then annual retrievals of that information when the intended recipients of the monetary distribution would have to recall the date and the reason for gathering at the statue. While at first it may seem odd to leave such a long gap between each retrieval opportunity, as opposed to the very frequent rehearsals that were recommended for memorizing a speech, longer rather than shorter spacing has been found to be much more effective at promoting knowledge persistence and accessibility over the long term. Though a longer interval allows for more forgetting, for example, the name or the birth date of the portrait subject or details of his or her career, the greater effort necessitated to bring what remains to consciousness allows neural connections to be formed anew. In essence, the information is re-encoded each time. Furthermore, the feedback provided on these occasions of retrievals, the reading of the inscribed statue base or the presentation of money, reinforces the connections. Significantly, cognitive research suggests that if information is retrieved at regularly spaced intervals for a relatively limited duration, one long-term study found for 3 to 5 years, that information was protected from the effects of forgetting and could be recalled by a person many years after it was first encoded. That means that even if the ritual cleaning and monetary distributions took place for only a few years, as funds and piety allowed, the cognitive impact on participants' knowledge of the donor was profound and perhaps indelible. The ritual cleaning and dressing, distribution of money, and the banquets that were stipulated to take place in physical proximity to the statues or in temporal proximity to the date of dedication may serve to aid in the ongoing re-encoding of information about the portrait subject in another aspect. These events presented heightened sensorial stimuli in the form of special lighting, smells, and visual decoration, as well as positive emotional arousal. Furthermore, these presentations are closely associated with a defined goal, receiving that portion of food or money. Studies of the effect of emotion on memory suggest that attention is narrowed to focus on central information related to the accomplishment of a goal, facilitating its encoding. Other studies have indicated that encoding of information is enhanced when it is encountered just prior to emotional or stimuli arousal, that is, the viewing of the pleasingly adorned statue and the receiving of the gifts. Therefore, it is possible that these transitory rituals taking place at the foot of a public statue first helped the observers filter out peripheral information, such as the presence of other public portraits and the merits of their subjects, and second, made a stronger impression of the specific identity and qualities of the person whose portrait they were actually gathered around. The annual retrieval of this same information, the gift and generosity of the portrait subject, then reconsolidates that knowledge for the long term. The entirety of such a public portrait monument, object, ritual, distributions creates a complex cognitive process that promotes effective long-term learning about the portrait subject. This kind of cognitive complexity, especially when it allows for different but conceptually similar items of information to be interleaved with each other throughout the learning process, also importantly creates a greater facility on the part of the learner to make meaningful comparisons and discernments among similar types of things. That is, perhaps could be said that a participant at a periodic statue-associated ritual who had also exposure to other public portraits in the meantime would be better able to distinguish one notable from another and to compare their qualities according to the criteria of public honor. Though I do not have time to go into detail today, I do want to add that given the importance of iterative ceremony and ritual for a public portrait's cognitive effectiveness, it bears thinking about how the same learning goals could be met in the absence of a portrait. I have argued elsewhere, based on Roman legal evidence, that private donations of periodic festivals and games, often bearing the names of the donors until the mid 3rd century CE in Asia Minor and presided over by relatives and heirs of the patron were accepted as serving a commemorative function no less than a gift of a public building. But a case can be made that the ability of these physically ephemeral but regularly spaced spectacles to perpetuate the knowledge of the benefactor's generosity and worth to the community lay not only in the association between name, kin, and event, nor even in the epigraphic record. Rather, the symbiotic relationships between those elements and the reiterative and rewarding nature of these festivals allowed the knowledge of a patron's liberality to be broadcast and continually cognitively reinforced. Thus, the quadrennial Demostheneia festival, which encompassed also extensive animal offerings, was as important a component in perpetuating the public's knowledge of Demosthenes' munificence as were his portrait and the inscribed stele in the market square. And even taking into account the vagaries of financial endowments, it could be the case that after 3 or 4 iterations of these events at fixed intervals, the semantic memory of the benefactor and his or her gift would have been stabilized in people's minds for some years, even after the events ceased to take place. This possibility then begs us to consider why some benefactors would opt for gifts of spectacle rather than donations of tangible and physically durable architecture. To conclude, my presentation today is the beginning of my attempt to understand the relationship between visual culture and the cognitive processes of learning and memory. Obviously, much more work remains to be done, among other things, to see if cognitive learning patterns also define the various kinds of interactions with statues as public notice boards or landmarks. In addition, the higher priority placed by modern scholarship on architectural munificence should be reevaluated to take into account other kinds of memory and knowledge-building phenomena. By engaging with the cognitive processes of learning and memory, we may find new ways to explore and understand the interdependence of material and spectacular culture and of honorific, funerary, and religious artifacts and practice. Thank you.